Hello everyone, welcome subscribers, welcome followers. Okay, it has been a while. I haven't posted anything for the last 2 or 3 days. I have been engaged in a little bit of an unexpected battle because I had the idea of reacting to Tucker Carlson's interviewing an Argentinian politician, and I thought it would be interesting for me to react to this. I had seen his interview with Orban in Hungary, and I thought, oh, okay, interviewing a politician, there's going to be an election in Argentina, fine, I'll see how it goes. I didn't know anything about Argentinian politics. I was soon to find out. So I did a reaction in English, fine, no problem. But then I decided to do it in Spanish, and my goodness. The comments were all so negative to what I was saying, but they were not replying to anything I had said. I had never experienced this before. I mean, insults and all kinds of very, very negative comments, sometimes accusing me of things that, of being a communist and all kinds of things. It was remarkable because I had never experienced this before. I have had, for the most part, I have, positive comments. There are some who disagree with me, that's fine. But never a torrent of absolute, insults. So I have spent a little bit of time replying to them, just saying, just explaining things. But anyway, it's been quite an experience. And what I see is this particular candidate, I see it as you're either for him 100% or you're against him. It seems as if it is developing into a sort of a Trump-like figure, that you either are 100% with him or against him, and so on. So it's most interesting. Anyway, so that is why I haven't posted anything for the last 2 or 3 days. I'm going to talk today to you. I'm going to share something which I mentioned about 4 or 5 days ago about this particular book that I'm still reading. And I never, how I share with you sometimes, if I'm reading a book, a novel, whatever it is, and I share it with you for whatever reason, it has got my attention. Of course, I don't, I don't get any commissions or anything for this. But this particular book, Sedated, How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis, and it is by Dr. James Davies. I think it's a new book. It was published... let me see here. It's published by Atlantic Books. Came out in 2022. And this is going to be the first time that I say this, but I really, really, really recommend this book. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It's £10.99. So it's not excessive at all, but it is an amazing book. I will just read you what it says at the back, the blurbs. Sedated is a polemic of great clarity that will make you feel at once angry and reassured. That is from the New Statesman. Then in Britain alone, more than 20% of the adult population take a psychiatric drug in any 1 year, an increase of over 500% since 1980. Despite this prescription epidemic, levels of mental illness of all types have increased. Using interviews with experts and detailed analysis, Dr. James Davies argues that this is because we have mischaracterized the problem. Rather than viewing most mental distress as an understandable reaction to wider societal problems, successive governments and big business have blamed sufferers and their brains. Urgent and persuasive, Sedated systematically debunks this individualistic view of mental illness and explains why it is so dangerous. And that is from the Herald, an intelligent and powerfully argued book. And then one more. Davies is one of the most important voices on mental health in the world. This is a beautiful and deeply sane book. Everyone who is suffering and wants to know how to make it stop should read it right away. And that is from Johann Hari, author of Lost Connections. So he's going to explore what we mean now by mental illness, how the definition has been expanded, how it seems this is an old story really, that doctors just tend to prescribe drugs and so on. He goes into it in great detail. He talks about not only doctors, but psychologists, psychiatrists and so on, but also taking the same approach to schools, children who perhaps are being naughty or can't sit still or whatever it might be, are immediately prescribed. He gives the reasons why teachers are under a lot of stress to identify it early, whatever the problem is. And so in good faith, most of them don't want to let it pass just in case there is a problem. So immediately there is a problem here and so on. He goes also at schools, at obviously high schools and secondary schools, universities, and also in the place of work and the pressures that exist there. So he goes into great detail, and he doesn't just give you numbers and facts, but he's also a good storyteller, and I will be quoting him directly in just a couple of times. But I'm going to start with, in the middle of the book, having explained all the problems with medication, and he goes deeply into depression and the causes and so on. He talks then about deregulation and what happened when governments deregulated companies, be it I'm going to have to be careful with the words, which because there are still things that you cannot say openly and so on, but with the industries, be it the finance, the banks, and the everything else, and also the pharmaceutical industry. And he says in 1960, a little-known senator from Tennessee found himself at the heart of a congressional storm. His name was Cary Estes Kefauver, and he was responsible for starting one of the most significant industrial battles of mid-20th century America. He was the chair of a government committee overseeing corporate fraud, consumer rights, and fair competition in U.S. industry, when he came across some information alleging fraudulent practices occurring on a wide scale in the PH industry. The evidence was so compelling that his committee decided to have an inquiry into these companies. It lasted 3 years. And hearings revealed at that time that companies were marketing new drugs as dramatic breakthroughs, even though they were not showing improvements over medicines that were already on the market. Frenzy advertising designed to sell trade versions of drugs that were already being sold as generic and at a fraction of the cost, and more. They were making excessive profits by bringing I can't read my writing, by bringing drugs to market without having to provide any clear evidence for their efficiency. The government at the time had little authority. We're talking about the early 1960s. The government at the time had little authority to enforce either good manufacturing practices or effective testing. And the absence of any regulation at the time meant that billions could be prescribed that possessed no medical value at all, or worse, were harmful to patients. So you can imagine what happened. Accused of threatening the viability of the industry, of trying to put government bureaucrats between patients and their doctors, trying to expand the power of government unnecessarily. That is how they reacted to these inquiries. And they said if greater regulation was adopted, drug prices would rise, innovation would slow down, hundreds of thousands of people would lose their jobs, etc. In other words, powerful opposition rose, and so his attempt to legislation seemed at the time all but doomed. But something happened then, again, 1960s. A disturbing epidemic had begun to spread across Europe. Increasing numbers of babies were being born with severe defects, hands and feet starting out of their torsos, deformities that were really horrid, but very, also at the same time, very, very painful, and causing early death. Oddly, this was mainly in Western Europe, while in Eastern Europe appeared free of all this. West Germany at the time was most affected, leading to theories that the epidemic was perhaps due to chemical warfare by the Soviet Union, things like that. But then the cases began to appear in countries far, far from the Soviet bloc, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil, in West Africa. So alternative theories began. Perhaps the deformities were due to unknown toxins or impure water or undetected parasites or nuclear testing, perhaps. But while all these theories were going on, children were continued to be born with these terrible deformities. And at the height of the crisis, an unknown German pediatrician called Widukind Lenz, Dr. Lenz, L-E-N-Z, saw that more and more babies were being brought into his surgery with these deformities. So he started investigating himself, took extensive histories of the women to see if there were any common links. Eventually, one factor would emerge, and that is that 80% of the women had been taking an antidepressant and insomnia drug during pregnancy. Besides, when Dr. Lenz compared this 80% with a large group of other women who had not been taking the drug, and the babies were not had not been affected, he believed that he had found the common link. And when he presented his findings to the manufacturer demanding that it remove the drug from the market, the company refused to do so, calling his research shambolic, no good, etc., etc. It took another doctor in Australia who published his research supporting Dr. Lenz's work in The Lancet, the journal, the medical journal, to convince the medical community that an allegedly safe drug, an antidepressant and insomnia little pill, was at the root of the tragedy. This small, round, white pill is now infamously known as thalidomide. Well, what followed? A ban of the drug and a stop to babies being born with these disabilities, severely disfigured babies. So now it was impossible for Congress, for Senator Kefauver's, to ignore it any further. And so he proceeded to expose some of these companies' misconduct. So from now on, they moved to prove that they would have to. Sorry, I can't read my notes here. They would have to prove that the medicaments that they put on the market were actually, as the saying goes now, safe and effective. So this little pill had never actually been approved in the United States, as a matter of fact, because there had been concerns about its thyroid toxicity. But thousands of samples, nevertheless, had been distributed to US doctors to help with unregulated trial investigations. And then eventually President Kennedy finally gave Senator Kefauver his open support in 1962, and it was signed into law, the regulation of these companies. So from now on, you would have a tighter regulation on both safety and efficacy of medicines. And within a few years, many other countries, including the UK, follow suit. The devastating effects of this regulation that these companies had argued would follow did not come to pass. All those, terrible things that they were saying. That if you pass regulation, there will be all these terrible consequences. In fact, as a matter of fact, industry entered one of its most productive periods during which new vaccines for polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, pneumonia, meningitis were developed alongside many others for, nervous system, cardiovascular, and so on. But this strict period of the 1970s regulating these companies was soon to change. By the end of the decade, a new series of events would radically alter all this. And enter Professor Milton Friedman, famous economist, Nobel Prize winner in economics. We know him for his trickle-down economics. Don't worry about wealth at the top. It will filter, it will trickle down. It didn't quite happen. Perhaps more concentration of wealth. But I'm going to read you now, because I said that he is a good storyteller, Dr. James Davies, the author of the book. And he says, Milton Friedman first met Margaret Thatcher at number 10 Downing Street in 1980. She had invited him and his wife for a small and intimate dinner with herself and her then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Geoffrey Howe. As they sat, eating soup and lamb stew, they discussed the far-reaching new capitalism economic reforms her government was then implementing with gusto. Thatcher had invited Friedman to number 10 not just because she held him in very high esteem, they broadly shared the same political and economic ideology, but because Friedman had rapidly become an economist of significant global influence. He was now a Nobel laureate and one of Ronald Reagan's key economic advisors. He also recently achieved almost celebrity status in the US, owing to the success of his recently aired TV documentary series Free to Choose, which Ronald Reagan had partly introduced, in which he championed the virtues of free markets, privatization, deregulation, and the other mainstays of neoliberalism. That TV series, reaching millions of viewers in the US, was now about to be broadcast on the BBC in a prime Saturday evening slot for 5 consecutive weeks. Friedman was about to receive mainstream media attention in the UK, and Thatcher, just before his public ascendancy, wanted to secure his full support. As the pair sat consolidating a friendship and collaboration that would last throughout Thatcher's time in government, Friedman was busy championing the matter of deregulation, a subject close to his heart and on which a full episode of his TV series was focused. In sum, he argued that any government truly committed to the free market enterprise must work tirelessly to deregulate all key industries, that is, to remove all government rules, regulations, or red tape that inhibited their productivity and profitability. Industries such as banking, energy, communications, transport, and pharmaceuticals should be allowed to bring their services and products directly to the market without any government oversight or interference. He argued that in a truly free society, it should be the market and not the state that determines the fate of any product, innovation, service, or company. In Free to Choose, Friedman selected the example of medicines regulation to drive his point home. Sitting before a panel of experts in the University of Chicago's Law Library, from where the series was largely filmed, he began by critiquing the new stricter controls on drug safety and efficacy that Kefauver's congressional reforms had ushered in following the thalidomide crisis. He argued that these controls had given rise to a regulatory culture that had become far too risk-averse and even stopped potentially life-saving drugs from reaching the market. He said, and I quote, therapeutic decisions that used to be the preserve of the doctor and the patient are increasingly being made at a national level by a committee of experts. That's what he wrote. And these committees and the agencies for whom they're acting are highly skewed to avoid risks. So there is a tendency for us to have drugs that are safer, but not to have those that are effective. And that was an important point. So his solution, therefore, was to deregulate. And Thatcher would find eventually a compromise. She would take regulation out of the hands of the state because she was actually afraid that the people in the UK were not ready at the time to just do away with regulations. So she actually found a sort of a middle ground. And what was that middle ground? She would take regulation out of the hands of the state and give it, bit by bit, to a newly created semi-private regulatory agency, largely funded by the industry itself, while operating, though, under the auspices of the Department of Health, which was really the perfect solution for her. The industry would progressively be encouraged to shape its regulations, that is, to influence the process by which one could say that it was supposedly independently governed, and to do so in an industry-friendly direction. And this would be done in many areas, not just in health. In other words, find less volatile solutions to industries without upsetting the voters. Simply give the industry itself, whichever industry it might have been, or happened to be, give them unprecedented influence over the regulatory process. That would mean that the industry itself, actually would no longer need to lobby government directly for more lenient policies, because it actually had access to the regulatory process itself. So their fortunes rose rapidly. From the 1970s to the early 90s, there was an increase of output in the PH industry of 70%. Prescription sales more than tripled from 1980 to 2002, and then with a steady growth of about 6% per year. So deregulation then had driven up sales, investment, consumption, and profit, just as Milton Friedman had argued it would. But there was another story that was starting to emerge here. On July the 17th, 1997, a backbench Labour MP, backbencher for those who are not from the United Kingdom, are members of parliament who do not have a cabinet office, regular MPs. Okay, so a backbench Labour MP, David Hinchcliffe, from Yorkshire, was out and about when he received a phone call asking him to return to London immediately, among other things because the BBC wanted to interview him that very evening. So he had to go to London. This is pre-Zoom days, yeah? Well, it turned out, you see, that he had just been appointed chair of the House of Commons Health Select Committee, one of the most prestigious in Parliament. And he was as delighted as he was surprised. He said, "I didn't even know I was in the running to be the chair." So let me read you now from what the author says. For those unfamiliar with what the Health Select Committee does, its remit is fairly simple. It undertakes reviews on current health policy, makes recommendations to government, and generally holds our health departments and systems to account. At its best, it fights for the public good against vested interests, government inertia, and outworn policies that may harm the public interest. Its more recent activities have included forcing the government to invest in tackling, for example, child obesity, pushing for a ban on smoking in public places, arguing the case for increased maternity provision, and putting its considerable weight behind the new sugar tax. Some of you will agree, some of you will disagree. In short, it acts as Parliament's conscience, the author says, on all health-related matters. Now, David Hinchliffe is now in his late 60s with a reassuringly friendly Yorkshire accent. He spoke to me, says the author, with great enthusiasm about his first 2 years chairing the committee. Quote, "At this time it was a wonderful job. As chair, I had a key role in deciding what work should be done, and we were making some excellent headway implementing valuable reforms." His relationship with the then Health Secretary was close and productive, and many of the committee's recommendations were taken up. However, by late 1999, the Blair years, the atmosphere had changed considerably. This followed Tony Blair's decision to appoint a new Health Secretary, Alan Milburn, who immediately set about reforming Labour's relationship with the NHS, with the National Health Service, along the lines of the previous Thatcher and Major governments, resurrecting the Conservative policy of marketising key National Health services along the lines discussed earlier by the author. The role of private companies in running the NHS services was expanded. Patients were rebranded as customers, for whose business health providers would now have to compete. A new raft of managers was ushered in, trained in the new managerialism and charged with setting targets, streamlining services, and refining employment contracts. Finally, many National Health Service functions were outsourced to private companies, which would come to provide, over the next 10 years, key support services in catering, portering, parking, laundry, cleaning and planning, and clinical services too in dentistry, general practitioner provisions, diagnostics, and surgeries. By 2015, private companies had become so pervasive, that they were actually getting 15 billion pounds each year from the national health budget. So this MP, he felt more and more, with these new changes, more and more marginalized, as it were, that more and more private contractors were brought in. And this feeling of being marginalized reached a tipping point in 2003, when he joined a further 84 MPs in voting against the government going to the war against Iraq. He says, if you are in a party and you profoundly disagree with the direction your leader is taking you in, and you don't see an end to that leadership, he said, something had to be done. So he decided to resign, well, not to stand for office in the next election. He says, I could have stayed frustrated in Parliament till my old age, or I could get out and do something valuable elsewhere. But before he exited, he knew that there was still time for some important work in the committee, the health committee. He says, for years I'd wanted to do certain inquiries on the committee that I felt were absolutely critical. On the list, and a very important one for me, he said, was an inquiry into the PH industry's influence on medicine. Both sides of the House by this time had become aware that healthcare in the UK was being unduly manipulated by industry interests. So he launched an inquiry, and over a period of months, the committee cast its net very wide, collating evidence, consulting expert witnesses from health professions, from parliament, academia, the industry itself, media, patient organizations, medical charities, relevant government departments and agencies. It was a thorough report, and at the same time it was quite a damning report. The industry was aggressively advertising its products to prescribers on a large scale, while offering sometimes misleading information that downplayed harms and perhaps overplayed benefits. Making significant payments, for example, speakers' fees, consultancy fees, and other honoraria to so-called independent medical doctors, largely for marketing purposes, offering promotional hospitality masquerading as education, dubious research practices. Let me go back to the book. A quote from the MP: "We heard allegations that clinical trials were not adequately designed, that they could be designed to show the new drug in the best light, and sometimes fail to indicate the true effects of a medicine on health outcomes relevant to the patient," said the report. "We were informed of several high-profile cases of suppression of trial results. We also heard of selective publication strategies and ghostwriting. In all, the inquiry revealed a litany of practices that appeared to serve industry interests at the expense of public health. Companies were engaging in unethical research, marketing and data reporting in order to cast their drugs in the best light and expand the market. But what surprised and concerned the committee most of all was that the big pharma was just getting away with it. The regulation of medicines was failing on a huge scale, just as Cufarb, the senator, had discovered to be the case before his reforms were implemented in the US in the 60s. What the Health Select Committee had therefore uncovered was that the agency responsible for regulating pharmaceuticals, today called the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, had simply become, quote, too close to the industry, a closeness underpinned by, quote again, common policy objectives, agreed processes, frequent contact, consultation, and interchange of staff. The revolving door. The report concluded by calling for an overhaul of the system, for an effective regulatory regime to ensure that the industry works in the public interest. Unfortunately, the present regulatory system is failing to provide this, as it is insufficiently effective. To offer some insight into why regulation was seen as failing, just consider the following barrage of regulatory practices that the agency embraced, all of which still operate today, and many of which were criticized in the Health Select Committee report. First, for the MHRA to approve a drug for public use, companies are only required to provide 1 or 2 positive clinical trials, i.e. trials showing that the drug works better than a placebo. Even though 2, 3, or many more negative trials may exist, that is, trials showing that the drug works no better than a placebo. This is because the MHRA can discard negative trial data when considering a drug for approval. And critics point out that clinical research is all about probabilities, the probability that one thing works better than another. So if negative data are omitted, the evidence base is skewed in a positive direction, favoring the product and the company seeking the license. This issue is particularly relevant for the approval of antidepressants. As negative trials have been common, almost half of all the trials into antidepressants have turned out to be negative. If we include this negative trial data in overall assessments of antidepressant efficacy, they show that antidepressants, as a matter of fact, are only slightly more effective than sugar pills. And that is only for around 15% of people taking them, the most severely distressed. For the rest of the patients, they are no more effective than placebos. These facts were unearthed not by the regulator, but by independent researchers who included in their large meta-analysis the negative data buried by the industry and ignored by the regulator. That's point number 1. Number 2. Second, the MHRA does not require a company to prove that its new drug is more effective than the most effective drug of that class already on the market. All a company need do is show their new drug to be more useful than taking an inert substance, that is, a placebo. This arrangement is justified on the grounds that if a patient has a rare reaction to a common treatment, then having an inferior alternative is better than having nothing at all. The author goes on for quite a long. I'm asking you. I'm recommending that you read it. He goes on for a long time explaining this point. But a third point. Thirdly, number 3, when a company submits a clinical trial to the MHRA to seek approval for its drug, the MHRA does not routinely examine the trial's raw data, i.e. the data as it stood before it was processed by the company. Rather, it can simply just examine a research summary of the data written by the company. While this practice is justified on the grounds that it speeds up the approval process, something companies demand as it saves costs, critics argue that summaries of research are liable to be biased interpretations of the raw data and may also omit data that is harmful to the drug's prospects of approval. Therefore, full inspection of all the raw data is in the public interest. Such lax regulation may help explain why companies were able to bury trial data clearly showing that most SSRI antidepressants, when prescribed to children, increase suicidal feelings. Data that, once it emerged, led to recommendations that most of these drugs should not be prescribed to children and adolescents. Again, it was not the regulator that spotted this problem, but BBC investigative reporters, as a matter of fact. Fourth, the MHRA has no anti-revolving door policy, but actively encourages interchange of staff between itself and industry. For example, many members of the MHRA's executive committee were previously ex-pharmaceutical industry professionals, including former chief executive Ian Hudson and director of standards Gerald Herald, both of whom were directors at GlaxoSmithKline for many years prior to leading the regulatory agency. While such practices are justified by the MHRA on the grounds that insider knowledge may lead to more effective regulation, critics argue that the MHRA recruits those who are instinctively sympathetic to their previous or future employers, and that furthermore there is no good reason why, having worked in industry, is essential to fashioning good regulation in the public interest. In fact, the evidence as it stands appears to support the opposite. Point number 5. The MHRA approves psychiatric drugs on the basis of short-term clinical trials, 2 or 3 months, while longer-term trials are not customarily requested. This is justified on the grounds that long-term trials are not only very costly for companies to undertake, but that their time intensity may impede effective drugs from reaching the market. Critics point out that since many drugs are taken for periods far longer than those covered by short-term trials, long-term trials should be requested, not least because many drugs, while showing benefits in short-term studies, are harmful and or ineffective when consumed long-term. For example, while most psychiatric medications were approved on the basis of short-term trials, emerging evidence now shows the adverse effects of long-term consumption, something, as you may remember, we talked about earlier. This is the author talking. There is point number 6. The MHRA relies heavily on the idea of post-marketing surveillance, in quotes, to justify approving drugs for public use, even though significant concerns may still exist regarding their safety and effectiveness. This assumes that the drugs will be carefully monitored post-approval. But the reality of the surveillance means that the regulator has effectively allowed large numbers of patients to unknowingly become subjects in a public experiment into whether the drugs are indeed hazardous. The existence of post-marketing surveillance was recently used to justify approving a variant of the highly addictive drug ketamine for the treatment of depression. The PH company that manufactures esketamine, Janssen, only produced 3 clinical trials for the regulator, 2 of which revealed that the drug is no more effective than a placebo, with the third showing very minor, clinically insignificant benefits over a placebo for a short period. The National Health Service Prescribing Guidelines Committee looked at this data and concluded that the NHS should not pay for this drug. The supporting evidence was just too weak. but the pharma fee-funded MHRA, on the basis of the very same data, reached a different conclusion, approving the drug's public use. And finally, also medicines regulation at the MHRA is exclusively funded by fees from the PH industry. What is more, the MHRA has to compete for these fees with other European medicines regulatory agencies. This is due to the European Union's rule that if one national regulatory agency within the EU approves a drug, then the path to EU-wide approval is far easier. And this arrangement has effectively created a market within which different national agencies compete with each other for lucrative licensing contracts. The competitive environment in which regulatory agencies now operate has been shown to incentivize light touch regulation. If your regulatory process is too strict, you're likely to lose out on licensing fees to a more lenient competitor. Research has shown that this regulatory race to the bottom favors industry interests over those of patients. What happens now that the UK has left the EU remains unclear, but this was written in 2022, but with Boris Johnson's government allegedly pushing for further deregulation, it is unlikely that standards will improve. 5 months after the Health Select Committee's report was published, exposing many of the problems with the MHRA outlined above, a headline appeared in the British Medical Journal. Quote, UK government fails to tackle weaknesses in drug industry. This referred to the government's response to the Health Select Committee's report, which was simply, as Hinchliffe put it, miserable on all our key recommendations. Anyway, there is so very much more in this book that I actually, as I said, I recommend it, and hopefully it has given you food for thought. Thank you for your attention. Please subscribe. Thank you. Bye-bye.